Okay, so you want to get straight to it, right? You want like the need to know info about this tool we're looking at without having to read like a whole
Yeah,
textbook.
yeah, exactly.
Well, that's what we're doing here.
Yeah.
This is like a deep dive.
Yeah.
You've given us some really cool stuff, actually, like actual documentation and a little peek at what it does in action. So our mission today is to figure out how this Gemini Repo CLI thing really works.
Right.
What it's for, like, what's its purpose,
Yeah.
and how it actually operates sort of behind the scenes.
Exactly. And we've got the blueprint for it. It's called the READ. That's like the instruction manual.
Right.
And then we also have some real world evidence, right? We can see it working in the form of that log output. You could think of it almost like, you get a new gadget and you read the manual and then you actually watch someone use it.
Yeah.
So we're going to do both those things and kind of synthesize them so you get a really clear picture.
Perfect. Okay, so let's start unpacking this. So first of all, just the basics. What is this Gemini Repo CLI? Right.
The READ says it's a command line tool from Google. Sounds pretty straightforward so far, right?
Yeah.
But here's where things get really interesting. Okay. The main thing it does is it generates content for a specific file.
Exactly.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, so a lot of things can do that already. But the key difference here, the thing that makes this really unique, is that it uses other files from your repository to give it context.
Right.
And that's what I'm curious about. Like, how is that different than just like other AI writing tools that, can access information from like the whole internet?
Yeah, that's a great question. So unlike those more general AI tools, this one is specifically focused, right?
Yeah.
Not on the entire internet, but on the specific knowledge that is in your project's repository. And that means, it can do some really specific and interesting things. Think about, if you're trying to find inconsistencies between your code and your READ file.
Oh, interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
Or if you want to generate like a high-level summary of some new feature.
Yeah. But you want it to be based on specific parts of the code. You pointed at those files, and it can kind of summarize that.
Oh, wow.
So it's all about, leveraging and tapping into the existing specific knowledge that you've already got.
So it's like it's already studied your homework.
Yeah, exactly.
Before it helps you write the paper. That's amazing. That sounds incredibly efficient. Okay, so in terms of what it can actually do, like what are the main functionalities?
So the core action, like we said, is generating content.
Yeah.
Based on a prompt that you give it.
Okay.
That's like your instruction.
Right.
But what makes this one special is that contextual awareness.
Yeah.
You can actually tell it which specific files in your repository it should be looking at when it's generating this new content. So it's way more targeted and informed.
Makes sense.
Than just a generic content generator.
Right. So it's not just like a blind request.
Exactly.
You can say, okay, look at these documents while you're working on this new one. I bet that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of like making sure it's relevant to what you're doing.
Huge difference.
Okay, cool. So the README also says we get to pick which Gemini model is doing the work.
Yeah.
And conveniently, the log we have actually shows us the default. It looks like it's called Gemini 2.0 Flash.
Exactly. So unless you tell it otherwise.
Right.
That's the specific AI that's going to be doing the work.
Good to know who's driving the bus. What other capabilities does it have?
Well, it's pretty versatile in how it handles the output.
Okay.
It can either just display it right in your command line. That's called the standard output or std out.
Gotcha.
Or if you need to save it for later use,
right,
you can tell it to write it to a specific file.
Okay.
And then a really nice feature is it's got this built-in structured logging.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say that logging looks really helpful, even just from the little bit that we've seen.
So it keeps track of what it's doing. And that can be super valuable if something goes wrong, for troubleshooting.
Totally makes sense. Okay, so it sounds like a really functional tool. What if someone's listening to this and they're like, okay, I want to try this out. What are the must-haves? Like, what do they absolutely need to have to get started?
Yeah. So the README lays out the prerequisites pretty clearly. First off, you're going to need Python, specifically version 3.8 or later.
Gotcha.
And then you'll need pip, which is basically the standard tool for installing Python packages.
Right.
That's how you get all the other software that this tool needs to run. And then really important, you'll need a Google Gemini API key.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Which you can get from Google AI Studio. So that key is basically your permission slip.
Right, like your digital handshake.
Exactly.
With Google's AI.
To use the models.
Makes sense.
Yep.
So once you have all that stuff sorted out, how do you actually get the Gemini Repo CLI onto your computer?
So the installation is pretty typical for a command line tool built with Python.
Okay.
The Read.me mentions cloning the repository, which essentially means you're just creating a copy of the tool's code on your local machine.
Gotcha.
Then you got to install the dependencies.
Right.
Which are like other software libraries that the tool needs.
Right.
And pip will handle all that for you.
Yeah.
And finally, you install the CLI tool itself. And usually you just run this setup script called setup.py.
Right.
And then from then on, you can type Gemini Repo CLI, and it will work.
So pretty standard tech setup then, nothing too crazy.
Right.
Now you mentioned needing that API key.
Yeah.
How does the tool actually know that you have permission to use the Google AI?
That's where the configuration comes in.
Okay.
And the most important part is setting up that API key.
Right.
The ReID says you have to set it as an environment variable.
Okay.
Which is like a really common way for these types of tools to handle sensitive information.
So why an environment variable specifically? What's the advantage of doing it that way?
It's mainly about security. You know, you don't want to like accidentally share your API key. Plus, it lets you update it later without changing the actual code of the tool.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
So they recommend adding the command to set that variable in your shell configuration file.
Right.
So it just automatically happens every time you open a terminal.
Like the .bashraq file or CSC.
Yeah, exactly.
Are there any downsides to that approach that people should be aware of?
Well, one thing to think about is if you're on like a shared system.
Oh, right.
You have to be careful who else might have access to your environment variables.
Oh, that's a good point.
But for most individual users, it's like the easiest and safest way to do it.
So, okay, we've got it installed.
Yeah.
Knows who we are.
Right.
How do we actually tell it what to do? Like, what do we type?
So the read.me breaks down the command structure pretty clearly.
Okay.
The main command is Gemini Repo CLI.
Mm-hmm.
And then it takes 3 main arguments.
Mm-hmm.
The repo name.
Right.
The target file name.
Okay.
And then the prompt. So the repo name is just, you know.
Yeah, the name of the repository.
Exactly.
The target file is like the file that you actually want it to generate the content for.
Yeah.
And then the prompt is like the instruction.
Yeah, look what you actually want it to write.
So if I wanted to add a summary to my readme file, and my repository was called Awesome Project, and the file was readmd,
yeah,
and I wanted just like a short overview,
right,
I'd type something like Gemini Repo CLI, Awesome Project, readme.md, write a concise summary of this project.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the basic structure.
Okay, cool.
But it also has some optional arguments.
Yeah.
That give you even more control.
Oh,
like there's one called API key.
Right.
Where you can just include the API key directly in the command.
I think it's probably better to use the environment variable though, right?
Yeah, generally, yeah.
Okay.
And then op model name lets you pick a different Gemini model if you want to experiment.
Oh, fun.
And then output file lets you save the output to a file.
Right, we talked about that.
And a really important one is file paths,
okay,
which is where you list out the specific files that you want it to consider as context.
Okay, so you've got the main command and then these modifiers to really tell it exactly what to look at.
Yeah.
That sounds like a good combo of simple and powerful.
Yeah.
Now we have this log output showing it working. Can we take a look at that and see how these commands translate into like an actual real world scenario?
Definitely. So the exact command that was run here is Gemini Repo CLI KickServe Kick.Template.klmx-f.
Okay.
So let's break that down.
Yeah, piece by piece.
Gemini Repo CLI, obviously, that's how you call the tool.
Right.
KickServe, that's the repo name.
Okay.
Kick.Template.klmx is the target file name.
Uh-huh.
And then notice those 2 single quotes.
Yeah.
That means it's an empty prompt.
Oh,
so it's basically saying generate content based on the context files.
Wow.
Without me giving you any specific instructions.
So it can just do that. It can just figure it out.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Like, what kind of situations would that be really useful for? What kind of output would you even expect?
Yeah. I mean, it makes you wonder, right? Like, can it just look at those files and figure out what needs to be in this target file?
Yeah.
Maybe it could be used for, like, you know, generating a basic template.
Oh, that's interesting.
Or an outline.
Okay, cool.
And then the rest of the log shows us exactly what happened.
Okay.
So first we see status, success, which is just like a general confirmation that it started.
Right.
Then status, Gemini Repo API initialized successfully.
Oh, okay.
So it was able to connect to the Google Gemini API using those credentials.
Cool.
Then it says model, Gemini 2.0-Flash.
Right, so that's the default one that we saw earlier.
Exactly.
Okay, and then there's this line that says, AFC is enabled. What is AFC?
AFC stands for automatic function calling.
Okay.
Which is kind of a more advanced feature.
Gotcha.
Where the AI model can actually interact with other tools or services.
Oh, wow.
And you can actually see there was an AFC remote call that it made and completed.
So it's like reaching out to get more information.
Exactly. And then there's the HTTP request log, which is just showing the communication between the tool and the Google Gemini API.
So it sent a POST request to Google and got a 200 OK back, meaning everything's good.
Exactly.
And then finally we get these nice confirmation messages.
Right.
Content generated successfully. Content printed to stout.
Perfect.
So even though we didn't give it a specific prompt, it still did the whole process of like analyzing the context, generating content, and then presenting it.
Awesome.
Now, this pasted text source, that seems to show how the tool organizes the information it's using. We see these lines that start with this special character and different tags. What's the point of the structured format?
So this is how the tool expects to get its input.
Okay.
And how it organizes its own data. Gotcha. There's 3 main types of sections.
Okay.
And they all start with that little symbol.
Right.
First, you've got context sections.
Yeah.
Like context_file.kick.template.klmx and context.klmx kick template.
Okay.
And those are for extra info, like things that can help the AI understand, but that aren't actually part of the final output.
So it's like giving the AI some reference material before it starts writing.
Exactly, yeah.
Cool.
And then you've got const sections, like const.repo name.
Okay.
And those define like constants, like the name of the repository.
Right, which in this case was KickServe.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then finally there's content sections. Which is the actual input or the prompt.
Okay.
Like the main thing that you want the AI to work with.
And it also looks like it has a rule for how to generate markdown content based on all these different sections.
Exactly. So it takes the instruction, even if it's blank, the context files and those constants, and it feeds it all into the Gemini model.
And this way of formatting it, like with the tags and stuff, it keeps everything organized.
Exactly.
And it knows what's actual content versus what's just like background information.
Exactly. And it also shows you how it handles context specifically related to a file.
Right.
So it doesn't just know the content. But it knows where it came from and its role in the project.
That's really cool. So it's like a super well-prepared brief that you're giving to the AI.
Exactly.
With everything labeled and clear so it knows exactly what to do. Okay, so just to sum up everything we learned about this Gemini Repo CLI. It's a command line tool from Google that uses the Google Gemini API to generate content for a specific file. And the really cool thing is that it can use other files from the same repository as context.
Which makes the output so much better.
Way more relevant. So you tell it what to do. By typing commands in your terminal. You give it the repository name, the target file name, a prompt, which like we saw, can even be blank.
Crazy.
Totally. And then you can use those options to specify the context files and other settings. It's all designed to make the content way more intelligent. By using the knowledge that already exists in your projects.
Right. So you're basically bringing that power of AI directly into your development environment.
Exactly.
Where you're already working.
So this brings up a really interesting question for you all listening. Think about the projects that you're working on. How could a tool like this completely change how you create and manage content? Like imagine being able to automatically update documentation every time you change your code.
That would be amazing.
Right. Or generating new code snippets that just perfectly integrate with what you've already written. And it's all done just by typing a few commands. And letting the AI understand the context of your project.
Right.
What do you think? What new possibilities does this open up for you?
It's a really powerful concept to think about.
It is, for sure.
And I think it's just one example of how we can use AI more and more in our work.
It's not just about this one tool. It's about the whole idea of being able to use what we already know in such a targeted way.
And it's just going to keep getting more exciting from here.
Totally agree.